For the past year, I've had the honor of working alongside two colleagues from Creighton University. And they're going to teach us about something that's been happening behind the scenes here for a little while. And I have copies of it in front of me for anything you need. Father Tom Simonds is a Catholic priest and a member of the Society of Jesus. He is currently Tim's Professor of Humanities at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, and oversees the undergraduate core curriculum. He has held a number of leadership positions in Catholic secondary schools, including principal and school trustee. Father Tom is the author of 18 articles, maybe more since I saw that, on Catholic educational issues, and has authored numerous NCEA publications. Prior to joining Creighton, Dr. Ron Fussell was an associate superintendent of schools in the Diocese of Manchester in New Hampshire, where he led innovative efforts to improve diocesan curricula, leadership development, teacher and principal evaluation, and Catholic school identity. Dr. Fussell is a core faculty member in Creighton's innovative educational leadership program. He teaches courses for aspiring Catholic school leaders, and he directs the graduate certificate in Catholic school leadership. He, of course, is also an NCEA author. So it's my honor to pass the mic to both of them.
So Father Tom, you can unmute yourself and everyone will hear you when you're ready.
Good, yeah.
There we are.
It's great to be with all of you virtually. I'm on the campus of Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, where Ron and I teach. And big rain yesterday, but sunny and cool today, and not much leaf change. We haven't had any frost. It's been a really late fall for us. But I know that eventually winter is coming, so. But it's good to be with you today and to talk about the work that Ron and I and Jill and others have done on the national standards for executive leaders of Catholic school systems. I think one big CSL theme that we're touching on is using the NSBECS. So we've mapped these new standards to the NSBECS as well as to the benchmarks within NSBECS. So we want to work together with what we already have. We don't want to have two competing sets. We want to have them be linked to one another. Although the NSBECS, as you know, focuses on the individual school, whereas the standards we're working on are going to focus on the system level. So the Catholic school office, the superintendent's job description role, as well as other executive leaders, offices and roles. So leaders of regional schools or consortium schools or network schools. So I think we're ready for the next slide, Ron. Probably be your objective. So at the completion of this presentation, we want to make sure that you leave with some important information and knowledge and skills. So you're going to learn about how we're working together to develop these standards more specifically and how they align to NSBECS. And you're most importantly going to have an opportunity at the end of the session to provide feedback to us. Some of you have already looked at a draft of the executive leader standards, and others of you are seeing them now. Either way, you're going to have a chance both virtually and there in Salt Lake City to provide feedback to us. That's probably the most important part of this. Give you a little information to give you the background and the context, but then to get your feedback, because we really want these standards to be practical, usable, and based on what is the situation for executive leaders that are currently in the position. Next slide.
Thank you, Father. And can you all hear me okay? Perfect. Normally I'm used to wandering around the room when I present, and especially today, so I'm all hyped up on coffee. But I'll try to stay here so that the live stream people can see me. Wanted to spend a few minutes just talking to you a little bit about the study from which the standards were inspired. So last spring, we had published Father Tom and Dr. Tim Cook, who many of you know, and I completed a grounded theory study of 10 Catholic diocesan superintendents who recently left the profession. So they didn't move laterally or to another diocese to take up a different superintendency somewhere else. They just entirely left the profession. They've gone on to other things. So it was a qualitative study, 10 Catholic superintendents. We identified a need within that study for consistent national standards based on best practices for system level leaders. Some examples that we'll hear about, for example, we discovered an unevenness in the scope of authority of superintendents across archdioceses, which we thought was very interesting. Also an unevenness in the quality of onboarding and induction processes across archdioceses. And I'll talk a little bit more about that outside the presentation. So the study started with the question, are Catholic school superintendents leaving positions early? Now we know from the literature that in the public sector, superintendent turnover and attrition is often described as a crisis. This is probably because there's such strong research that connects the quality of system leadership with student achievement. The literature on the public school superintendency also confirms that superintendent tenure has that positive correlation with student achievement. Not much is known, though, about Catholic school superintendent attrition. There's the Deal study, and we did consult with that in our work. But apart from that, there's not a whole lot out there. So we asked questions that gauged how long former Catholic school superintendents planned to remain in their positions and how long they actually remained in their positions. We found that on average, Catholic school superintendents who left early were planning on staying for about 8 years, and they left after about 6 years. 9 out of 10 of the participants in our study left early. And in that discussion, they identified a number of things that they had set out to achieve in their tenure, but weren't able to, such as increasing enrollment, opening new schools, leadership formation programs, and instructional improvements. So we see the vicious cycle renewed. One superintendent leaves, another comes in, establishes new priorities, has similar difficulties and leaves early. And we know how damaging these false starts can be to organizational culture. So it's something we definitely need to work at. So understanding the context of these superintendent departures, I think is important. Some former superintendents have had positive perceptions of their departure. They said things like, I think it was pretty positive. I was blessed by a great staff, blessed by great schools. Others said it was positive, that the great relationships with Archbishop and bishops and all of that. Certainly they shared a lot of celebrations and gifts of all those things. But there were some negative pieces too. So some of the words that we heard about their experiences leaving the superintendency were bitter, frustrated, cynical. The Archbishop was furious with me. And again, leaving prior to achieving goals we thought was important. So in terms of the specific issues that our study revealed, first, and it's not on this slide, I did want to note that the participants didn't just write the entire time we talked to them. They noted a number of dimensions of the superintendency that were fondly remembered. Specifically, there was a resounding consensus about how relationships that former superintendents built with principals, teachers, CSO staff especially, were inspirational and life-giving. Others discussed positive relationships with donors, faculty, and board members. Of all the positive comments about dimensions of the superintendency that our participants shared, nearly all of them were relational or interpersonal in nature. But with that said, there were some specific drivers that led superintendents away from the profession. So in the graphic, the most prominent was difficulties with the chancery. So communication problems, feelings of being an outsider, frustration with the bureaucracy and navigating all of that. Perhaps in your work in the central offices you come from, you've experienced some of that. Lack of action on the part of archdiocesan leaders was something that came up quite prominently. So the idea that I'm a superintendent and we've worked hard at developing this new policy, and then the bishop who previously supported it no longer supports it. And that's very frustrating given all the work that is involved in developing those types of things. So that was something that came up. The idea of the unhealthy workload, burnout, finding balance between a good parent, a good mother, a good father, a good parent, and balancing the demands of the Catholic school superintendency is really challenging, and that was something that many of our participants mentioned. And then also that salary and benefits were not as competitive as other opportunities. So just a note about the pie chart, many of these comments that participants raised overlapped, so that's why they don't add up to 100. At Creighton, we do know how to do that. So they were from different questions from our protocol. So in terms of extending the tenure of the superintendency and getting superintendents to remain in the position longer, we found a few things. First, that half the participants reported that they did not have a job description, when additional participants said that there was a job description, but he categorized it as inadequate. Others stated that the job description was just what was posted online when the open position was listed. So we at Creighton feel that an effective job description is a basic necessity for job effectiveness. And it clarifies lines of authority and eases organizational tensions. So in other words, it helps everyone to stay in their own lane. National standards can help sharpen the focus on what needs to be included in an effective superintendent's job description. Similarly, about half of our participants reported that they did not have a regular performance review. One of those five, only one of those five, thought that the performance review that they did have was effective. Others described the process as pro forma, such as a letter that would show up in their personnel file, just show up there one day, or inequitable compared to other senior executives in the Chancery. So they were, had to undergo this rigorous process, and the Secretariat for something else had a much different process. So there wasn't equality there. So we feel that performance reviews, to be effective, should be transparent, should prioritize goal setting, and really be relevant to the needs of the superintendents. National standards can identify best practices as they relate to performance reviews, but what we all know is a highly challenging and interdisciplinary line of work. Finally, 80% of our participants reported no access to induction or mentorship programs. We heard comments about induction processes merely being timed with the HR binder on the first days of the job. One participant mentioned that their induction plan was just simply a note left on their desk by their predecessor. Standards-based induction or mentorship would provide an overview of the roles and offices of the Chancery, decision-making processes, and the roles of the Chancery staff members themselves. And then there was this. I'll just let that marinate. So Bishop Braxton this morning talked about the importance of authentic faith witness. And literature on Catholic school leadership is replete with how important the leader's personal and professional faith life is. So when asked if the Catholic school superintendency strengthened or diminished their faith, 7 of the 10 participants stated that their faith was diminished. So we believe this to be a significant finding from our study. One comment that was repeated verbatim by several participants who had nothing to do with each other was that nothing challenges your faith more than working for the church. So that was not that we heard that once, but from multiple people in the same way. National standards can help clarify organizational culture issues that tend to challenge superintendent's faith. So on the horizon, we see a looming crisis. Crisis in turnover and retention may be looming due in part to frustration with the current operational model, and consistent national standards might help to alleviate this crisis. Many of the issues that led to interview participants leaving the superintendency early were bureaucratic and relational. So we feel that a set of consistent national standards aligned with NSBECS adopted in our archdiocese would create best practice operational structure that would promote superintendent retention and better Catholic schools. So why do we need national standards? Well, we know that our interview participants also stated that the complexity of the superintendency as currently set up led them to become frustrated and leave their positions. Future superintendents and new superintendents need to be exposed to effective training and professional development experiences to build capacity for the diverse range of responsibilities that come with the job. National standards could help to clarify superintendent responsibilities, and then plans could be developed for preparation programs and professional development. And national standards can also identify overreach of a job description to create a more focused and manageable set of responsibilities. Back to you, Father Thomas.
Thanks, Ron. Great overview of the study, bringing out a lot of the information that we discovered. And obviously, I'm a Catholic priest, a Jesuit. I've worked in school administration at the principal level and the school board, governing board level. Honestly, when I read the findings, I was disappointed, and I felt bad for the people that had to work in what seemed to me, at least from what they told us, to be a lot less than ideal situation. And so that's why Ron and I and Jill and others are working on these standards, because we believe that if archbishops, bishops, and leaders of school systems see what a best practice school office and a best practice job description and so on looks like, we're hopeful that change can happen. And our plan is to do a pilot study with some school systems to determine if these standards are actually effective in creating a more positive environment, but also in terms of stopping the trend of school closures and consolidations. So to put together the standards coming out of our study, we decided that standards would be a good thing. Obviously, some of the standards were developed directly from what we found in our study. For example, the thing about not having much of an induction process. Ron and I and Tim Cook and others who have worked in Catholic school systems know that how important a good induction process is for lots of different reasons. And so we were able to create some of the standards from our own study. But then we also looked at the study done about a survey of superintendents by Cattaro and McDonald, done in 2015. And a lot of the things that they found in that survey were similar to what we found in our interview process. But there were also some things in their study that we didn't find, because our study was focused obviously on 10 individuals who had recently left the superintendency. And Cattaro and McDonald had a much more far-ranging survey that they asked people about. And so they were able to identify some issues that we didn't. We also looked at the United States Catholic Bishops document, their most recent document. I think it's the most recent document on Catholic schools, P12 Catholic schools, renewing. And they talk about the ideal in that document, both in terms of the fact that schools would be accessible and affordable, and accessible both geographically and also for a variety of types of students. And so we were able to draw some standards from that document, or reinforce other standards that we had already developed and maybe tweak them a little bit with some language from renewing. We also looked at a doctoral dissertation by a woman from Loyola Marymount, Nick Dow, you see there on the slide. She did a focus on women in the Catholic school superintendency. And then we looked at an article published in the Journal of Catholic Education by some researchers at Notre Dame, Miller, Wittenbach, and Nuzzi. Some of you might know Father Ron Nuzzi. They looked at how superintendents in Catholic school systems were responding to the COVID-19 crisis. But in the context of that article, they talked quite a bit about ideal practices for superintendents. And so we were able to, again, correlate the standards that we'd already developed from our study and from the 2015 study by Cattaro and McDonald, get further support. So we were looking for confirmation of our standards. We were looking to see if anything needed to be added. And we found a lot of confirmation for the standards that we had come up with. through looking at renewing, through looking at the research by Nick Dow, and by looking at the research by Miller, Wittenbach, and Nussey. Next slide, please. So then when we started talking with Jill at NCEA, we realized that we wanted to align these executive leader standards. We don't have a good name for them yet. We've come up with some various options. I like SLICS the best, but we're still working on a good name with an acronym for them and so on. But we're just, for right now, we're just calling them the executive leader standards. So standards for people like superintendents, directors of regional school systems, or presidents of regional school systems or consortiums, executive directors, people of that level. That's who these standards are going to be directed at. So we wanted to align these standards with the NSBECS so that we kind of have one. NCEA and Catholic education in general has one set of standards, and there's going to be some other things that NSBECS will be applied specifically to this group or that group within Catholic education, but we didn't want to have complete separation. So we started mapping the executive leader standards to both the NSBECS standards as well as the NSBECS benchmarks. As you know, each standard in NSBECS has a number of, so the standard sets out kind of the best practice principle, and then the benchmarks give very specific, detailed descriptions of what that standard would look like. And you can use the benchmarks as a pathway to determine, how would I meet this standard very concretely? And so we did the same thing in the executive leader standards. We have general principles standards, and then we have benchmarks, which provide very specific, detailed descriptions of what it would look like to meet that standard. And we're hopeful that those very specific benchmarks can be pathways or stepping stones for executive leaders to say, okay, our institution, our school system is way behind on sharing best practices in faith formation for faculty and staff with individual schools in the system. Each individual school is doing it on their own. There's no coordination or collaboration. So that's one of the standards, that an executive leader would share those resources available in the local community and more broadly for faith formation for faculty and staff with leaders of individual schools, so that you have one kind of office coordinating that, and it's a little less work for the building principal and other leaders in the school. It might also provide more consistency in what that faith formation looks like, perhaps more quality as well. And so how does that executive leader do that? And there's some specific benchmarks under that. We've already had input from the NCEA NSBECS Council, which is abbreviated NNC. I know for myself, I see NNC, I'm like, what is NNC? So it's the NCEA, National Catholic Educational Association NSBECS Council. So a group of educators from schools, from higher education that meet and pursue initiatives around NSBECS, and they looked at these executive leader standards and gave us some input and feedback on those. And so that input's already been integrated into the draft of the executive leader standards that you've looked at. Today, you're going to have an opportunity to give us more input and feedback on the standards. We have some guiding questions that the leaders of each group will use to do that. We're also going to ask other people for feedback. So we have a survey that we're going to send out after CLS to consortium leaders, regional school leaders. We also want to ask the U.S. bishops for their input on this process as well. They gave input in the NSBECS, and so we want to make sure they have input on this as well. Okay, next slide. So here's our research study that Ron talked about. That is a hyperlink if you want to go look at it, but you could also just Google the title or the journal. It's online. It's a document they can access online. You don't need any kind of access code or anything, and you can download it and read our full study where we looked at what these 10 former superintendents were saying about the Catholic school superintendency. Next slide. So now it's your turn, and we look forward to your feedback. I'm going to be sitting in on a virtual feedback session, and so if you're joining virtually, I look forward to seeing you there. Otherwise, hope you have a good time in Salt Lake City, and it's been great joining you.